Before we begin, I want to share something with you. Due to a monetization issue, I won't be able to upload new videos until March 19th. I just want to say thank you, truly, for all your support, messages, and loyalty. This channel has always been about original stories, real effort, and giving you the best content I can create. I've never believed in copying or taking shortcuts, and I never will. This isn't goodbye. It's just a short pause. I'll be back soon, stronger, focused, and ready to continue. Thank you for standing with me. See you very soon. If you can't keep up, maybe it's time to step aside. The new VP said it with a smirk, like he was delivering a clever line he'd practiced on the drive-in. His name was Eric Halverson. He'd been with the company for 9 months. I'd been there for 15 years. I ran the encryption systems department from the ground up. Every protocol, every compliance audit, every emergency patch that kept regulators, clients, and governments off our backs. I looked at him, nodded once, and said, "Understood." That seemed to throw him off. He expected an argument, a plea, maybe even tears. Instead, I thanked him politely, shut down my terminal, handed my badge to HR, and walked out without another word. By 6 a.m. the next morning, I had 173 missed calls. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Eric fired me on a Tuesday afternoon, right after the weekly executive sync. He didn't even bother to close the blinds in the conference room. Floor-to-ceiling glass, full view of my team outside. People I'd hired, trained, and protected for years. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, confidence borrowed rather than earned. "We're modernizing leadership," he said. "Your approach is solid, but dated. We need speed, flexibility." I almost laughed. Our department handled classified-grade encryption for financial institutions, defense contractors, and 2 government agencies. Speed without precision wasn't innovation. It was negligence. But I didn't say that. I didn't remind him that 3 months earlier, I'd personally stopped a breach attempt that would have triggered international reporting requirements. Or that the encryption framework he bragged about in investor meetings was built on an algorithm I designed during my 7th year, when we still worked out of a half-finished office with folding chairs. None of that mattered anymore. HR slid the termination packet toward me like a menu. No cause listed, just organizational restructuring. Eric stood, already done with me. "If you need help transitioning," he added, "we'll make sure someone walks you out." "No need," I said. "I know my way." I shut down my terminal myself, logged out, closed everything cleanly. I didn't delete files. I didn't sabotage systems. I didn't warn anyone. I just left. In the elevator, my reflection looked calm. Too calm, maybe. 15 years is a long time to give a company your brain, your weekends, your nights. But I'd learned something early in my career. Panic makes you sloppy. Silence gives you space. At home, I set my bag down, poured a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table. No anger, no shock, just clarity. Because Eric had made a mistake, a very specific one. He fired me without cause. Most people assume that means severance and hurt feelings. In my case, it meant contracts. Back in my 10th year, after a particularly brutal compliance audit, the board had approved a retention agreement for senior technical leadership. Not stock options, not bonuses, protection. The kind no one reads unless something goes wrong. One clause covered intellectual property created prior to a specific restructuring year. Another addressed patent assignment conditions. A third, buried deep in legal language, covered reversion rights if termination occurred without cause. At the time, it was framed as theoretical, a safeguard, something that would never matter. Eric never asked about it. He didn't consult legal before firing me. He didn't ask why the patent filings for our core encryption engine listed my name as primary architect rather than corporate assignee in early drafts. He assumed tenure meant replaceable. By midnight, I'd pulled the old agreement from my encrypted personal archive. Still valid, never superseded, never voided. By 2 a.m., I had my attorney on the phone. He didn't say much at first, just breathed slowly as he read. Mandy, he finally said, "When did they fire you?" "Yesterday, without cause." Another pause. "Then as of midnight, ownership status is complicated." By 4:30 a.m., the paperwork was filed. At 6 a.m., my phone started vibrating nonstop. Calls from my former director, from compliance, from legal, from numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails stacking faster than I could listen to them. One message stood out. It came from a board liaison I barely knew. "Mandy, call me immediately. There's confusion about the encryption patent. Since when do you own it?" I stared at the screen, coffee cooling in my hand. Since the moment they decided I was expendable. By the time the sun came up, the company I'd built my career inside was waking up to a problem it couldn't solve internally. And Eric Halverson, the man who told me to step aside, was about to learn what happens when you fire the only person who knows where the foundations are buried. By the time morning settled in, my phone had stopped vibrating and started demanding attention. I hadn't answered anything yet. Not because I was avoiding them, but because I needed to hear the shape of their panic before I spoke. Silence has a way of forcing people to reveal what they actually know. I sat at my kitchen table and listened to the voicemails in order. The first wave was predictable. My former director, trying to sound steady while clearly not being steady. HR representatives using soft language that didn't match the urgency underneath it. Compliance managers asking for clarification in voices trained to never admit fear. Then the messages changed. A corporate legal counsel left a voicemail that skipped pleasantries entirely. He sounded like someone who had just discovered a structural crack in a building everyone was still working inside. "Mandy, we're seeing an issue with the patent registry. Your name is appearing as the current owner of the Core Shield encryption framework. That doesn't align with our records. Please call me back immediately." Core Shield, the rebrand name. Internally, we'd always called it Aegis L, my architecture, my design. Marketing could rename it all they wanted. The foundation didn't care. Another message followed, rushed and barely coherent. Someone from IT security. "We're getting licensing validation warnings. Systems are operational, but compliance flags are escalating. We need to understand what changed." Nothing had changed. That was exactly the issue. A text arrived next from the board liaison. I'd met her maybe twice in 15 years. Both times in rooms where people spoke carefully and pretended not to notice who actually carried the technical weight. "Mandy, please confirm whether you initiated a patent reversion filing. The board is asking questions." I stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone down and called my attorney. "They've realized," I said. "They were always going to," he replied. "Once legal checks the registry, it becomes impossible to contain. Encryption tied to regulated clients doesn't stay quiet." "Are we exposed anywhere?" "No," he said. "They're the ones exposed. Now they'll try to make you blink." I didn't. I returned exactly one call. Not HR, not legal. The board liaison answered immediately. "Thank you for calling back," she said. "We need to understand what's happening." "What part?" I asked. There was a pause, then a careful response. "The board was informed that ownership of the encryption patent appears to have reverted. They were not informed that your employment ended." That explained a lot. "Then the board doesn't have the full picture," I said calmly. "Did you file the reversion?" she asked. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I was terminated without cause and the agreement allows it." Silence again, this time longer. I could hear pages turning, keys clicking. "That clause is old," she said finally. "Old doesn't mean invalid," I replied. "It means forgotten." She exhaled slowly. "The board would like to speak with you." "I'm available later today," I said. "Once legal finishes reading the documents they should have read years ago." She didn't argue. She couldn't. The rest of the morning unfolded through forwarded emails and quiet messages from people still inside the building. Eric Halverson had walked into chaos. Compliance had frozen non-essential deployments. Security teams were auditing systems that hadn't changed in years. Someone had finally pulled the original patent filings and realized my name wasn't just present. It was central. A former team lead texted me from a personal number. They're asking who has authority to approve encryption use. Legal says no one does until ownership is resolved. Eric is pacing. Good. HR sent a formal email asking me to clarify my intentions. I ignored it. Eventually, the board liaison called back. They'd like to meet in person, she said. The board chair, legal counsel, the CTO, and Eric. There it was. The full picture. I'll be there, I said. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet and let the situation settle. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. Running a department for 15 years teaches you something important. Systems don't respond to authority titles. They respond to permissions, contracts, and rules. Ignore those, and everything stops working. Eric had treated me like an outdated manager who could be replaced with a resume and a smile. But encryption doesn't work that way. Neither does ownership. Neither do contracts written to protect the company from exactly this kind of executive shortcut. By the time I stood up to get ready, the internal narrative had already shifted. I wasn't the former employee anymore. I was the issue. The kind no one could quietly smooth over. They didn't just fire the wrong person. They fired the only one who could legally authorize the system they were built on. The board didn't meet at headquarters. That alone told me how serious things had become. They chose a private conference suite in a business hotel downtown, the kind executives use when they don't want conversations overheard by assistants or recorded by internal systems. Neutral territory. Controlled access. No audience. When I arrived, legal counsel was already there, laptops open, documents spread across the table like evidence. The CTO sat near the window, staring at the city instead of his screen. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He looked like someone watching a system he understood unravel. Eric Halverson arrived last. He walked in with the same confidence he'd worn the day before, but it didn't sit as comfortably now. His smile was tighter. His eyes moved too fast, checking faces, looking for reassurance that no one offered. The board chair, Martin Keller, didn't waste time. "Mandy," he said, nodding for me to sit. "Thank you for coming on short notice." "Of course," I replied. This seemed important. Eric shot me a look. I ignored it. Martin folded his hands. "We've reviewed the patent filings and the employment agreement tied to your role. Legal has confirmed the reversion clause is active." Eric leaned forward. "This is being blown out of proportion. It's an administrative issue. Mandy filed something she shouldn't have." Legal didn't even look at him. "That's not accurate," one of the attorneys said calmly. "The filing was valid. The trigger condition was termination without cause. That condition was met." Eric frowned. "She ran a department. She didn't own the company's IP." I spoke before legal could. "I didn't own all of it," I said. "I own the encryption architecture I designed before the assignment terms changed. The contract allowed for reversion under specific conditions. Those conditions were satisfied when I was fired." Martin turned to Eric. "Why was she fired without cause?" Eric straightened. "Leadership restructuring, performance alignment." The CTO finally spoke. "That's not a cause. That's preference." Eric bristled. "We needed faster decision-making, new perspectives." "Unregulated encryption?" the CTO asked quietly. "You don't speed that up by removing the person who understands every failure mode." Silence followed. Martin rubbed his temple. "Eric, did you consult legal before the termination?" Eric hesitated just long enough. "No," he said. "It was within my authority." "It was within your authority to terminate," Martin replied. "Not to expose the company to this level of risk." I hadn't said a word in over a minute. I didn't need to. Legal cleared their throat. As it stands, the company does not have the right to deploy, modify, or demonstrate the Core Shield framework without Mandy's authorization. Continuing to do so would constitute willful infringement. Eric scoffed. You're saying we have to ask permission from a former employee to run our own systems? You have to ask permission from the patent holder. Legal corrected. Which happens to be her. Martin looked at me directly. Mandy, what do you want? There it was. The question everyone dances around until they can't anymore. I want clarity, I said. And I want accountability. Eric laughed once, sharp and dismissive. This is retaliation. No, I replied. This is governance. Something you skipped. Martin raised a hand, stopping Eric before he could speak again. What does clarity look like to you? Martin asked. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. Calm, measured. First, I said, the board formally acknowledges that the encryption architecture is my intellectual property under the current legal framework. Legal nodded. They already had. Second, any use of that architecture requires a licensing agreement, transparent terms, oversight included. The CTO exhaled, relieved. This was solvable. Eric shook his head. This is insane. You're undermining the company. I kept it compliant for 15 years, I said. You undermined it in one afternoon. Martin's gaze didn't leave mine. And the third? I didn't rush it. The person who made this decision shouldn't be overseeing the systems affected by it. Eric froze. You can't be serious. I am, I said. You fired the architect of the core system without understanding what you were touching. That's not leadership. That's liability. The room went still. Martin leaned back, considering. Legal avoided Eric's eyes entirely. The CTO spoke again, voice steady. If Eric remains in this role, every technical decision he touches will be questioned, internally and externally. We can't afford that. Eric stood. You're choosing her over me? Martin stood as well. We're choosing stability. Eric looked around the room, waiting for support that never came. I was hired to modernize this place, he said. And you were, Martin replied, right up until you removed the wrong load-bearing wall. Eric left the room without another word. When the door closed, the tension shifted. Not gone, but different. Manageable. Martin looked back at me. If we agree to your terms, will you license the system back immediately? Yes, I said, because I don't want the company to fail. I want it to function. The CTO nodded. Legal began outlining next steps. As the meeting wrapped up, Martin paused. One more thing, he said. Your role. We can't go back to pretending you're just a department head. I wouldn't expect you to, I replied. When I left the hotel, the city felt the same. Cars moved, people rushed. No one knew what had just shifted. But inside the company I'd built my career in, the balance of power had changed. And this time, it rested on something solid. The agreement was signed quietly. No press release, no internal announcement. Just a licensing document routed through legal with my name where the company's used to be. Core Shield was operational again, but now it answered to a different authority. Mine. By the next morning, the building felt different. Not louder, not calmer, tighter, like a system running under observation. I returned to headquarters for the first time since being fired. Not through the employee entrance, but through the executive elevator. Security didn't question it. My access had already been restored, not to my old department, but to the systems that mattered. The CTO met me outside the secure operations floor. He looked relieved and uncomfortable at the same time. I should have pushed back harder, he said as we walked. When Eric started cutting corners. You pushed back as much as you could, I replied. Authority only works if someone listens. Inside, engineers stopped mid-conversation when they saw me. Not out of fear, out of recognition. A few nodded. One actually smiled. No one clapped. This wasn't that kind of moment. We stepped into the control room where Core Shield's monitoring dashboards glowed across the wall. Everything was green, stable, compliant. For now, the CTO said, but we have a problem. Of course we do, I said. Show me. He pulled up a configuration tree tied to a pending deployment. Eric approved an optimization change last week. It hasn't gone live yet. Legal froze it when ownership issues surfaced. I scanned the parameters. My jaw tightened. This isn't an optimization, I said. It's a shortcut. It reduces latency, he said carefully. It reduces verification steps, I corrected. Latency improves because you're skipping checks. That's not speed. That's exposure. He nodded. That's what I told him. Did he listen? No? I straightened. Then it doesn't ship. It's already been promised to 2 clients, he said, including one regulated financial group. I turned to him. Then they'll wait, or they'll walk. That would be painful. So would a breach, I replied. Pain is relative. By midday, the consequences of Eric's decisions were surfacing everywhere. Compliance teams flagged undocumented approvals. Product managers realized timelines had been committed without sign-off. Engineers quietly admitted they'd been told to bypass review processes, temporarily. Temporary shortcuts have a way of becoming permanent disasters. The board reconvened that afternoon. This time there was no Eric-shaped gap in the room. His badge had been deactivated earlier. His company email already redirected to legal. Martin addressed the room. We're not here to assign blame, he said, which everyone understood meant the opposite. We're here to restore control. He looked at me. Mandy, we need your assessment. I didn't sugarcoat it. You promoted speed without governance, I said. That works in consumer tech. It fails in encryption. The good news is the damage is contained. And the bad? One board member asked. You'll miss a quarter, I replied. Maybe 2. But you won't lose your licenses, and you won't lose trust. Silence followed, then nods. Martin exhaled. What do you need? Authority, I said simply. Clear authority. Oversight over encryption-related decisions. Not symbolic. Actual. And reporting? He asked. I report to the board, I said. Not to product. Not to marketing. Not to anyone who benefits from pretending risk doesn't exist. The board didn't argue. The next few days were methodical. Systems reviewed, approvals reset, teams restructured, not dramatically, but deliberately. People who understood the work were put back in positions where their voices mattered. I didn't reclaim my old role. That role didn't exist anymore. Instead, I sat in rooms I'd never been invited to before. Budget meetings, risk committees, client calls where executives stopped speaking over technical explanations and started listening. One afternoon, a junior engineer stopped me in the hallway. They told us you owned the patent, he said, uncertain. Is that true? Yes, I replied. He hesitated. Does that mean you could shut everything down? I could, I said. But why would I? He thought about that, then nodded. Right. That night, I reviewed the last unresolved item in Eric's legacy, a pending demo scheduled for a potential government partner. The materials were slick, the claims aggressive, the safeguards optimistic. I sent one email. The demo would proceed, but only with corrected parameters and full disclosure. No shortcuts, no embellishments. The response was immediate. Panic, then compliance. The system ran flawlessly. Not because it was fast, because it was right. Late in the week, Martin called me into his office. We underestimated you, he said plainly. You underestimated the work, I replied. He smiled thinly. Fair. He slid a folder across the desk. A formal appointment. Not operational. Strategic. This makes your authority permanent, he said. And visible. I glanced at the document, then closed it. I'm not here for revenge, I said. I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again. Martin nodded. That's why this works. When I left the building that evening, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something better. The system was stable again, and this time it knew exactly who it answered to. 3 months later, no one talked about Eric Halverson anymore. That's how you know a company has truly moved on. Not when they condemn someone publicly, not when they rewrite history, but when a name simply stops appearing in meetings, emails, and hallway conversations. His departure had been processed the same way his decisions were eventually handled: documented, reviewed, and closed. The company stabilized faster than analysts expected. We missed a quarter, exactly as predicted. Stock dipped, then leveled. Clients grumbled, then stayed. Regulators asked questions, received clear answers, and signed off. There was no scandal, no dramatic fallout. Just a quiet recalibration that most people outside the building never noticed. Inside, everything had changed. My role was clear now. I wasn't running a department. I wasn't managing people day to day. I sat above that layer where decisions couldn't hide behind urgency or buzzwords. Encryption, security architecture, compliance alignment, nothing moved forward without a documented rationale and my sign-off. At first, some executives bristled. They were used to selling ambition. I sold constraints. But constraints are what make systems work. In meetings, I spoke less than most people. When I did speak, it was specific, measurable, tied to precedent or regulation. Over time, people stopped trying to argue around me and started preparing before they spoke. That was the real shift. One afternoon, the CTO joined me for coffee in the atrium downstairs. Not a meeting, just a pause between things. You know, he said, if Eric hadn't fired you, none of this would have happened. I stirred my cup. It was already happening. He just accelerated the reveal. He nodded. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd fought him that day? Yes, I said. I would have lost. He looked surprised. You can't win inside a broken structure, I continued. You can only expose it. By the end of the quarter, the board formalized a governance model that mirrored what we'd been doing informally. Technical authority was no longer subordinate to product timelines. Risk assessment wasn't a checkbox. It was a gate. Other departments took notice. I was invited to speak with teams I'd never interacted with before. Legal, M&A, even HR, who now consulted technical leadership before drafting executive contracts. Not because they wanted to, but because they'd learned what happens when they don't. One evening, as I packed up to leave, I passed the old conference room where Eric had fired me. The glass walls were the same. The table, too. Someone had replaced the chairs. I stood there for a moment, not out of nostalgia, but curiosity. I tried to remember how I'd felt walking out that day. I couldn't. What I remembered instead was the stillness afterward, the clarity, the moment when fear never showed up, because it didn't need to. At home, life felt quieter too. I slept better. I stopped checking my phone compulsively. The work no longer followed me like an unresolved equation. It stayed where it belonged, inside defined boundaries. One night, I received a message from a former colleague who'd left shortly after Eric did. You were right to stay calm. Watching it all from the outside, it finally makes sense. I typed back a simple response. Systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to structure. The board chair called me the following week. We're revisiting leadership training, he said, specifically around decision authority. Would you review the framework? Of course, I replied. After the call ended, I realized something had shifted again. They weren't asking me to fix a problem anymore. They were asking me to help prevent the next one. That's the difference between being useful and being valued. On my last walkthrough of the operations floor before the weekend, a new hire stopped me. I just wanted to say, she said, nervous but determined. People talk about what happened, not like gossip, like a lesson. I waited. They say you didn't raise your voice. You didn't threaten anyone. You just let the rules work. I smiled faintly. Rules only work if someone enforces them. As I left the building that evening, the lights behind me reflected off the glass in steady patterns. Predictable, controlled, secure. 15 years earlier, I'd joined a company that wanted to build something resilient. Somewhere along the way, they'd forgotten what that required. Getting fired wasn't the betrayal I once thought it was. It was the system correcting itself, using the only mechanism still available. They told me to step aside because they thought I was slowing them down. What they learned, quietly, permanently, was that I'd been the one keeping everything upright. And when the noise finally died down, when the calls stopped and the meetings normalized, one truth remained: clean and undeniable. I didn't take revenge. I restored balance. And this time, the structure was built to remember who held it together.